I'm going to be flying out to Canada dirt early tomorrow morning, so trying to prepare for that. Haven't even written my speech yet.
Okay. What are you doing in
Working
Canada?
on it. We're going to the Weekend Reason
Okay,
conference
cool.
in Calgary,
Awesome.
and then following that, I think on Monday we're going to go to the what is the name of that museum? A natural history museum, and I can't remember. It's a big deal one, and I've been there before. I can't remember the Drumheller. I can't remember what it's called.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
I know the New York one because that's where I grew up, is New York City.
yeah, gotcha. This is the one that has the mummified ankylosaur.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah,
That's cool.
and I've seen that before it was released to the public. Before they even announced that they had it, they were still extracting it from the matrix. And when we were up there, they gave me a private tour of the lab, which was really nice. And so I don't have it behind glass or anything. It's right there. And I could have
Wow.
chosen to touch it if I wanted to, but I got a really close inspection on it. And it is so perfectly preserved that when you examine the skin, it looks like grandpa's alligator shoes.
Wow.
Yeah.
I took my daughters to, we went to Utah a couple of weeks ago, and I took them to a museum out there, and they got to like handle actual fossils. Nothing like that, of course, but
Yeah.
just the $10 ones that they could get, and they got to use the professional tools and clean them out and stuff.
Nice. So, what did you want to talk to me about?
Well, I saw the video on your channel that I sent you a link to, and their professor was talking about the Article 5 convention process. And he made a number of mistakes that are fairly common for someone like him, who is an expert, I'm sure, has wonderful credentials and quite a bit of knowledge in constitutional law. But as he said himself in the interview, he had only just learned about this 6 months ago. So this was not a particular issue in which he had expertise. And this is an area, the Article 5 Convention is something that I've been studying for, since a little bit before my kids were born, actually. And they're 11 now. And the popular narrative, the kinds of sources that most people first see when they begin to look into it, are completely at odds and completely divorced from what people tend to see when the popular sources are completely divorced from the actual scholarly research. And I've been on your show before as a ramen a few years ago, which I greatly appreciate, and I talked to you about that at the time. But the misinformation sources are pretty powerful, and it's very easy for people to fall into to some of those things as well.
Well, give me an example. What's the important thing that we know?
We know that the Article 5 convention process, one thing that he talked about was particularly a right-wing push to use the Article 5 convention. I apologize. It's been, I should have rewatched the video. It's been a little longer than we intended for this interview. We had a power outage last week, and there were various scheduling conflicts. So I apologize for that. But one thing that he talked about was the a right-wing push to use the Article 5 convention. Almost every group that's working on this issue, that's working on that tool to use the convention, is doing their best to be nonpartisan. And people have different views about how successful they are. There is one group, and this is what I presume that he's talking about, that is not trying to be nonpartisan. That's a group called Convention of States. Most of their local volunteers are fine, and I know some of them, and they do try to be nonpartisan. The group leadership has gone back and forth, and right now is trying to be pretty partisan. But everybody who actually studies this stuff will tell you that it's simply impossible to amend the Constitution that way. Among the things that he said that you guys talked about on your podcast were the idea that once a convention is called, it can discuss any subject. You can look at the American Bar Association, the Department of Justice under both Reagan and Carter, the Congressional Research Service, several reports, and literally nearly every published resource that's looked at this issue, and they all agree that that simply can't happen.
Let me put something out that's a concern of mine. Friends of mine were worried when they were trying to impeach Trump. Had Trump actually committed had he violated any statutes?
Yep.
Because they're trying to treat the president as if it's a common person, and so that not all the same kind of crimes apply, or that a president can be charged with something that a regular everyday person cannot because of their heightened capacity. But in fact, Trump is not only, I think, guilty of these sorts of crimes, but had also violated a couple of known statutes. Now, you would expect that when the president commits a crime, and we can show what the crimes are, and that he would be impeached, and upon being impeached, he would be removed. And how many crimes has this man committed now? I mean, I was just going off of a list of a couple, and just for that one particular instance. And now there are untold many. I mean, when you commit all of these finance violations and all of these other things, you would expect, when you try to overthrow the government, if it hadn't happened yet, and we had this discussion about what if a president what if a president rallies a massive armed mob and tries to take over the Capitol and establish himself as a dictator under a coup? What would we do, right? Well, if you'd asked me that 50 years ago, the answer from everybody, both parties, would have been an automatic. That person would not only be apprehended and incarcerated, but he would probably be executed for sedition. Executed. That's the punishment everybody would have said 50 years ago for doing that. Would there have even been a consideration that instead we would let him languish in a ritzy golf course indefinitely, forever, while his crimes continue to pile up and nobody seems to do anything about it?
Yeah, there's a big difference between that scenario and this one. And the difference is what you're relying on.
Shut up, little dog. Shut up. Excuse me. One second.
No problem.
Cannot have a conversation with that stupid dog. Anyway.
So there's a big difference between that scenario and this one. And the difference boils down ultimately to what you're relying on for the enforcement mechanisms. In the case that you described, you're relying on Congress alone, essentially, and Congress alone by a large majority, by a 2/3 majority, in order to act to oust somebody who, for many of them, is a member of their own party. That's not what you're relying on for the Article 5 convention process. The courts have a role to play, the Congress has a role to play, the states have a role to play, and the delegates have a role to play. And quite frankly, I don't trust any one of those entities on their own. What I do trust is the network of them working together. We saw a taste of that in the January 6th incident that you were talking about. Not the riot itself, but the effort to try to use alternate delegates and various methods to overthrow the election. We saw a taste of that with many efforts to go through the various tools and machinery of the Electoral College process to try to
No, not under there. Not under there. Go. Sorry.
no problem.
I can't have any professionalism because I have dogs.
I have kids, so that gets in the way too sometimes. Anyway, as I was saying, we saw various efforts to go through the machinery of the Electoral College system and try to subvert it to get alternate delegates, to try to have Mike Pence take a maneuver that would be clearly illegal and subvert the Constitution. And that ultimately failed, and it failed because of the distribution of that authority among many different places.
But this is an important point to bring up because, yes, that failed. And we would have said before it happened that it wouldn't be possible to upend the government that way anyway.
Yeah.
But it very nearly did happen, even though we would have said the day before that it couldn't have happened. Certainly.
And that's what I'm getting at. Because that's the difference between the Electoral College and the Article 5 convention process. The end result of a vote in the Electoral College ultimately is guaranteed to be a new president. There's no way for that process to break that does not still end at the end of the day with a new president. So if you manage to break the process, you could end up with the wrong president. That's not the case for the Article 5 convention process.
But we're not talking about a president. We're not talking about a legal secession of power. We're talking about we're talking about a dictatorship.
Sure.
In a coup, in which case all of the rules go out. But
Well,
we
if
would
there's
have
a
said
coup-
that having armed maniacs storm the Capitol could not have established a new government. But in fact, it has. Earlier in the same year or later in the previous year, something like that happened in South America, as we've seen happen so many times
Sure.
in South America. That exact thing has happened, and it could have worked here, where as I said, if I'd asked a couple of years ago, people would have said it would have been completely impossible. It didn't happen, but we see now that it is possible that it could have happened. This is my concern.
Mhm.
So now we're talking about creating a whole new constitution.
No, that is not what we're talking about with the Article 5 convention process.
Assure me.
Sure. So the way the process works, and I'll explain first the way the process works generally, and then explain the enforcement mechanisms that are much stronger than what's in place for the Electoral College to ensure that the process works that way. The general process is different states call for a convention limited to a specific subject matter. The convention, those calls go to Congress once 34, 2/3 of the states call for a convention on that subject matter. Congress then sets the time and place for the convention to be limited to that subject matter. All of the states then send delegates. The delegates meet, discuss the issue. They're sent there for that specific purpose. And in many states there are, well, I'll get to what the states can do in a second. They're sent there for that specific purpose. They then propose an amendment on that purpose. It then goes back to Congress to send it on to the states. The convention can't send it on directly. The states then have to ratify it by not a 2/3 majority, but a 3/4 majority. Now, in every stage of the way, there are numerous protections and roles to play for 4 different parts of the government. First, the states themselves have the power to set the agenda in the convention by the language in their convention calls. States also have direct control over their delegates. That's a history that goes all the way back to 1788, but more recently in 2020, the Supreme Court unanimously affirmed the ability to have states directly control their electors to the Electoral College. And if they do anything they're not supposed to do, those electors would be removed, their votes would be invalidated, and then they would be replaced by another elector. And we saw that happen in 2016. That action that happened in 2016 was then affirmed by the Supreme Court unanimously in 2020. And many that language that was used for the Electoral College came originally from a law in New Mexico that was used for the ratification of the 21st Amendment, which was also done through state conventions for that. So that process, that language comes originally from the Article 5 process, was then affirmed for use in the Electoral College and affirmed again unanimously. Many states.
At the risk of sounding paranoid, I just want to
Sure.
remind you that when we talk about things that can't happen, if I remember correctly, in the 1800s, late 1800s, in California, somebody proposed a bill because they were tired of the Chinese immigrants coming over and taking over all the railroad jobs. And so they posed a bill to make it illegal to hire Chinese immigrants.
Chinese exclusion.
The person who presents this idea should have immediately snatched on the fact that this is unconstitutional and that this is grossly unfair to just humanity. But not only did they not catch that, but it went through the House and I think the Senate as well. And I might even have gotten signed by the governor. I would have to go back over it. But as I understood it, that made it to become law before it was subsequently challenged on its unconstitutionality. So that means that 200 legislators backed this. That is obviously unconstitutional. I just testified 2 days ago in the Texas state capitol about how unconstitutional it is to put the 10 Commandments up prominently displayed in every public school classroom by people, lawyers like yourself and politicians and such, who were claiming in their testimony that the 10 Commandments was the basis of the U.S. government and the basis of human morality worldwide. And so it doesn't matter that there's absolutely no truth to that. It doesn't matter that these people are deliberately lying and that what they're trying to promote is definitely unconstitutional. We would have said 20 years ago, 30, 50 years ago, we would have said it's not possible to do such a thing.
Yeah.
And then they did it. And then
Right.
when you talk about the Supreme Court justices get pushed through. Oh, well,
Sure.
we can't have this because McConnell already promised that if we're in an election year and all like this, then we can't force through a candidate. We'd have to wait for the next administration. Oh, it's not our administration? Well, then we're going to push it through, and it doesn't matter what I just said. And then Lindsey Graham says exactly the same thing. So you can't take what they say they're going to do and compare that to what they actually do. They're not the same thing.
Oh yeah, that was the one thing I just, other than the convention stuff, that was the other area where I disagreed with your guest previously. He was talking about accepting one of the Supreme Court justices, I forget which one, at their word. And I agreed with his conclusion, but for a different reason. I don't predict their actions based on their word. I predict their actions based on how they're getting paid. And the reason why I don't expect that the abortion pill will ultimately be invalidated is because the pharmaceutical companies have a very strong vested interest in making sure that judges can't remove the approval of a medication.
Because we are, in fact, an oligarchy.
Yeah, exactly.
Corporatocracy.
Yes. So I trust the corporate interests to not do the right thing, certainly not, but to be successful in most endeavors. The convention process, though, is different from a lot of those. The one thing that Antonin Scalia said, and I disagree with him about almost everything, but one thing that he said that I did agree with, if he could change one thing about the amendment process of the Constitution, he said he would make it easier, not harder. He said it ought to be hard, but not that hard. And I'm not sure how much easier I would make it, certainly not much, because I do agree with him that it ought to be hard. The fact is, it is enormously hard. Trying to use the Article 5 convention process to get an amendment on an issue other than the one that we're currently trying to use the Article 5 convention process to get an amendment on a topic other than the one wanted by the people and proposed in the convention would be like trying to land a man on the moon. And you get it so incredibly wrong that not everybody dies, but you land him successfully and safely on Mars. If things go wrong in this process, you don't get a different amendment. You get no amendment. And that's the fundamental difference between that and some of the other things where we've often relied on norms and seen them go wrong. The scale of the number of things that have to go wrong, the variety of the number of things that have to go wrong, and then having them go wrong in a way that doesn't just break the process and result in no amendment is virtually unimaginable. And at that point, what you're looking at is the scenario that you talked about before, which is an actual revolution. Now, if you're worried about an actual revolution, you're not worried about the Article 5 convention process going wrong. You're worried because the Article 5 convention process has absolutely nothing to do with the revolution overthrowing this country. It's just a different thing.
And I don't mean to sound paranoid. I mean, to put things in perspective. I mean, I had a child who was attacked by a medium-sized dog, and so when my children were small, I couldn't deal with having a big dog. We got a puppy that we thought was going to be a small or medium-sized dog, but then it ended up being. It wasn't the breed that we thought that we were told that it was. It turned out to be some 90-pound monster with something wrong in his head. And yeah, that ended up attacking, other like our cat and other dogs, and was clearly going to attack people as well. And so I ended up having to get it out of the house. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I can't have the big. It wasn't a matter of what. This is the point I was going for. It wasn't a matter of what it did do or what it would do. It was a matter of what it could do. Whether it would or not, I couldn't have the potential there.
Sure. When you look at ultimately, the point of Article 5 of the Constitution is to amend the Constitution. I think you'd probably agree that most of the best parts of the Constitution are the amendments, the First Amendment, 5th, 14th.
Yeah, I wish I could make other amendments. I mean, when they say in the Constitution that there should be a wall of, well, they don't say a wall. They just say that, you know, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Can we clarify what that means? You know, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And look now at how many people, or how many different ways the political majority seemingly is trying to undermine both clauses of that, as well as every other provision of the First Amendment. The freedom of speech. Well, we're going to sue everybody that we don't like. The freedom of the press. We're going to arrest the reporters. The freedom to assemble. We're going to put down laws that you can no longer protest commercial ventures, or you can't have these kind of demonstrations if there's somebody of political importance involved, whatever. You know, so they're going to find a way around all of this. I would love to have clarifications. You know, I would have loved to have had the explanation that, you know, Thomas Jefferson saw fit to explain this to his friends privately, but didn't put it in the document for the rest of us.
Yeah.
And so people will know about those private things, what he meant by that, but not apply it where they know it applies.
Well, let me give you an example. You used the word oligarchy earlier, and I 100% agree with you. That's what Wolf-PAC is fighting. This country is currently run by special interests, by the ultra wealthy. There's been studies, that famous Giles and Page study that showed absolutely no correlation between what the average person wants and what Congress does, and a near perfect correlation between what the donor class wants and what Congress does. And I don't think that comes as a surprise to any politically astute observer of our country. And we've seen people agree with that in polls across partisan lines constantly. That's the country that we have right now under the current Constitution. James Madison called, when there was the Alien and Sedition Acts, he called for the use of this process among every other process that was open to the states, to try to get what he called an explanatory amendment. He wanted to explain to Congress with an amendment to the Constitution that they were misinterpreting the First Amendment. And he wanted to use the Article 5 convention process in addition to lobbying the legislature itself, and in addition to then working to run with Thomas Jefferson to try to get presidential power to overturn it. He did every method that was open to him. We need, again, an explanatory amendment that explains that the Supreme Court has gotten it wrong when they say that that spending money, unlimited money on politics, is just speech. The First Amendment has always allowed for reasonable, content-neutral restrictions on the time, place, or manner of speech. That can include a reasonable restriction on the amount of money that can be used as a tool for speech, reasonable restrictions on the use of the corporate form as a tool for speech, as long as it's content-neutral and it's reasonable. But the Supreme Court has ruled that that spending money on politics doesn't even create the appearance of corruption. And that's the system that we have right now. So that's what we know we're dealing with. We also know that the Article 5 convention process itself has numerous protections. I only described one, which is the direct control of the states over their delegates. There's also the power of Congress to not send something onto the states if it was proposed improperly. There's the power of the courts to invalidate something that's sent on, invalidate an amendment that was imposed improperly. There's the ultimate power, which is ratification, where you need to have only one house in each of 13 states simply not bring it up for a vote, and then the amendment can't be ratified. All of those protections and more that I didn't mention are how we know that this process is safe. And when you're talking about the remotest possibility of a risk there versus the reality of the situation that we're in right now, I think there's no contest in how I weigh those two options.
Okay, so what had been proposed was that one of the things that they could say was they just rephrase and reinterpret what was originally written, or throw out what was originally written and just write something brand new, like where They simply declare that the United States is a Christian country. I saw people testifying to that effect
Um,
2 days ago, and I've been seeing
Hello?
it for decades. And when Australia was established as they took our constitution, almost like the original verbiage, um, and interpreted it very differently than what we did to make theirs a more religious nation at the onset.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, 1 second. You cut off, but you got cut off at a good time because my headphones just died. I'm trying to plug in a different set.
Okay.
Should have made sure those ones were fully charged. All right. Can you speak so I can see if I can hear you?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Okay.
I can hear you just fine.
So
Sorry,
Australia, when they were established, they took some of the original verbiage from our Constitution verbatim, and interpreted it very differently, so that they, where we understood the separation of church, or the generation of our forefathers that wrote it understood that the separation of church and state, what that was supposed to mean, the Australian government initially understood that completely opposite. So they became a religious country initially.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's funny that we were the first secular nation facing all of these other deeply religious countries, and the other deeply religious countries are now more secular than we are,
Mm-hmm.
and we're sliding backwards while they're following our original model. That's a bit confusing, but we understand how people will interpret and misinterpret and distort deliberately to get to their own ends. So I'm very concerned about any amendments. Allay might be of fears.
Yeah. So let's first set those in perspective. How concerned are you with the current situation without having an amendment to the Constitution, with the direction that we're going right now, specifically on the issue of money in politics? I'm sure there's many others, but
Oh, well,
this is
yeah.
one.
People are suggesting to me all the time. In fact, today, people are suggesting means by which we could change the system to take the money out of politics, to take the dependency on raising ridiculous amounts of money out of politics. And I agree, we should absolutely do that, because it leads to extreme corruption. And the founding fathers, again, spoke adamantly against allowing corporations to have any power. And I wouldn't even have thought, in my naivete, that corporations were a thing to be concerned with, or that they even existed in 1776. But but the founders were very worried about that, about the power that corporations could have to corrupt the government, and we're seeing that demonstrated in full light now.
I mean, they'd seen the power of the East India Trading Company, for example, which ran countries. Even the idea of corporations being able to have their own power of political speech was considered laughable up until the 1970s. In the 1978 Bellotti decision, the future Chief Justice, William Rehnquist, wrote in his dissent there that if you could look at the entire history of decisions on corporate personhood, and they were all things like the right to contract. They were all things that were in service of the rights of the actual people that the corporations were created for and are used by. Giving corporations their own rights as if they're their own persons was never anything that made sense. And that was something that was incredibly clear to William Rehnquist in the 70s. To see how far the court has gone from there, I think demonstrates the degree to which we're now living in an oligarchy. I mean, we're seeing inflation skyrocket, and the primary reason we're seeing inflation skyrocket, there's many, but the biggest cause, even the Wall Street Journal just acknowledged this the other day, that corporations are hoarding profits. They're using the excuse of inflation to hoard excess profits, which in turn is causing inflation to be even larger. And then the Fed, which is run by the banks themselves, is then trying to use interest rates and other tools to attack a completely different and much smaller cause of inflation, which is basically to make sure that we have more unemployment because they figure that will make prices go down. So I want to put any risks that we're talking about in the context of the situation we have now, where we have situations that, like you said, you've been talking to people who are working on ways to help alleviate the problem. And I have friends and colleagues who work on that as well. But they're all working on what's the best thing that the Supreme Court will let them do, rather than what's the best actual policy. And there's a giant chasm between those two. The convention process itself, once the convention meets, is then limited to that specific subject matter. It then sends the product that they write onto Congress for Congress to send it to the states.
So when you say it's limited to that specific subject matter, that would be very encouraging if we didn't already see that anytime there's somebody proposes a bill and it's going to be a popular bill, it's bipartisan, it's got support from both houses, and we know that's going to go. Tack something onto it to ride with it.
Yeah.
And then we can achieve some other undermining purpose. Yeah.
And there are several protections against that. The first one is the choice of delegates. Delegates would be sent there on a single issue agenda. In many states, they'd be elected. In some states, they would also be appointed. Regardless, they'd be sent there for a single issue. And that protects against a lot of the wedge issues and things that give rise to people who campaign on one thing and don't actually care about it. When people are looking at one particular issue, they tend the winner that tends to be much better reflected in the results, and we see that even more so beyond any other issue in the issue of money in politics. We saw that when Ben Bratt beat Eric Cantor on the right. We saw that when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez beat Crowley on the left. When the issue is money in politics, then money in politics actually has a reduced impact on the election and can even be counter-effective at times. And so that is one of the assurances of the quality of delegates that we'll see to make a proposal that would actually address the issue. We then have Congress, just as Congress would not send something onto the states if it had proposed it in a way that was unlawful. If, let's say, a simple majority of both houses called for an amendment in Congress instead of a 2/3 majority of both houses, we would not expect Congress to then propose a resolution to send that onto the states. Similarly, if a convention made a proposal that was not within the scope of its limitations, we would not expect Congress to send that onto the states, which is an additional layer of protection. We also have protections in the courts. There was an analogous case in Florida. Florida is one of the few states that actually has limited conventions. Most states use open conventions. Some of them do use limited ones, and there was been some studies that show that the limited ones are far, far more effective. And Florida demonstrated that in 2008 when it had a limited convention that was limited to budgetary issues. The state Supreme Court looked at the amendments that were proposed. There was a disagreement that I would characterize as an honest one from the delegates, where some thought that because the budget is a generally pretty broad issue, they thought that they could go a little bit broader in the scope of what they were proposing than others did. And the Supreme Court looked at the amendments that they proposed and said, these ones are within the scope of the authority that was granted to you. These ones are not within the scope of the authority that was granted to you. And so those amendments cannot be proposed. And then the ultimate protection is for the states themselves. Like I said, if just 13 state houses, not the entire bodies, not the entire legislatures, realistically 13 chairs of committees in across the country could prevent ratification of any amendment. And we've seen some very good amendments not be ratified because the bar is so high. The Equal Rights Amendment was not ratified. The Child Labor Amendment was not ratified, although that one is still live. And if you're want to talk to legislators in Massachusetts, where I am, and a few other states, they might consider ratifying that one still.
Yeah, and where was it that they did get that one? Because I mean, they've re-allowed a Republican-led bill in some states. It was just like last week, where they authorized for teenagers under 18 to work overtime, to work at dangerous conditions, to work night shifts. And that's okay, because they're all about family values, but they only care about the kids as long as they're in the womb. Once you come out, then you're part of the labor force, and and there's no free lunch there, literally.
Yeah. I highly encourage people to. I've gotten increasingly concerned about the need for a child labor amendment, as we've seen more corporations pushing for an expansion on child labor, trying to increase. We used to need one income per household, and if two people in a household wanted to work, that was great, but it wasn't required to make ends meet. Now you need to have two working parents in a household to make ends meet. And a lot of the corporations would like you to have 3 or 4 people working in a household to make ends meet, including the children. So I'm increasingly worried about the need for the child labor amendment. And I encourage your viewers, just the simple Wikipedia page for it lists the states that have and have not ratified. Tennessee has a ratification that they introduced recently. And there's quite a few states that I think would be sympathetic to ratifying the child labor amendment. That happen to be the same ones that are still needed to make that part of the Constitution. It's
I
actually
didn't know that this
pretty
subject,
close to getting ratified.
I didn't know that this subject would have come up in this conversation, where I might have Googled in advance to see how many states are currently arguing to permit child marriage.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many, but
Yeah,
I mean, there's
I
also
was
a
hearing
difference
about that
between.
just a couple of weeks ago,
Yeah,
how there are senators right now arguing that children as young as 12, and in some states, it's already the law was already in place to allow them to be married even younger
yep.
than that.
I do try to focus more on what's actually passing rather than what's proposed, because all kinds of crazy things get proposed. But there are cases where that kind of thing has actually passed in states as well, which is highly disturbing.
Yeah. I mean, nobody expected that they were going to overturn Roe, right? I mean, people, very
A lot of people
comfortably,
expected that they were going to overturn Roe. A lot
people
of
were,
people
people
did
were
not,
very
who probably should
comfortably
have.
saying, well, no, that's established precedent. It's been 50 years. Nobody's going to, you can be terribly confident about that and still be shown to be wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I was pretty confident that they were going to overturn Roe. As soon as Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, I was pretty confident that they were going to overturn Roe at that point.
Oh, I've been dealing with these people, not in the capacity that you are, but I've been dealing with the right-wing religious conservatives for at least a quarter century, and long enough to know that this has been a long game plan. They
Yep.
fully intend to do it. This is how they intend to do it, and now
Yep.
they've got their big break.
And they've done it using money in politics. Frankly, it's not even the main thing that they were going for. The main goal of the Federalist Society in pushing for judges, and they've been using their power of money in politics in order to push these things through. It has been to get judges that are right wing on financial issues, pro business, and they've been using a lot of the ideological right wing issues to try to help drum up support for what their actual agenda is, even though they didn't really care about that until I think it was around the late 70s or so.
Yeah. Otherwise, what have they got? They
Mhm.
can get alarmed about trans issues because they know that their constituency is only capable of thinking in black and white terms,
Mhm.
and that they tend to be very selfish. We're not going to be concerned about other people's problems that aren't us. If it's not
Mhm.
my problem, that the problem doesn't exist and we can make fun of it. That
Mhm.
seems to be largely the attitude that I'm seeing. We need to have something that doesn't fit the binary and therefore sounds scary, so we've got to make a big deal about that. We need a boogeyman as well. I'm
Yep.
constantly hearing about you, that we can ignore all of the travesties that are coming from the far right and pretend that somehow there are some 2 or 3 leftists out there that are somehow even more dangerous than the unified far right, which,
Yeah. Wolf-PAC, of course, is nonpartisan.
yeah.
Personally, I'm left wing. But Wolf-PAC is an organization. I mean, I was talking
Yeah,
to.
we should mention that too when you say nonpartisan, because another thing about the binary, they think Democrats are left wing. No,
Yeah.
there are more left wingers in the Democrats, but every
Yeah.
president in the entirety of my life has been identified as being in the authoritarian right. That's
Yeah.
Democrats and Republicans, all of them.
I would personally agree with that. It's I do want to make sure to note that Wolf-PAC is nonpartisan. I was just in Utah with a friend of mine who's a a high-level Mormon and state legislator and cares very deeply about this issue as well, and would disagree with pretty much everything we said on this podcast, except for the issues about the corrupting influence of money in politics and the issues about the protections over the Article 5 convention process. And frankly, that's the only way you can get an amendment to the Constitution. Fear-mongering over what this is actually something that he brought up when I spoke to him, and we were in a meeting with other Republicans. And he brought up a conversation that he had with a left-wing Democrat here in Massachusetts, where I live. And that was the primary sponsor of Wolf-PAC's resolution here. And he asked him, what would happen at a convention if you brought up trying to repeal the Second Amendment? And he said, well, that couldn't happen. It would be ruled out of order instantly because it's not within the scope of the convention. And that's absolutely true. And even if it weren't, then it would not be, then if it were, the delegates would be repealed, their vote invalidated, they would be recalled and replaced with another delegate. It would also, if that somehow made it through all that process and got proposed, it would be sent to Congress. Congress would not send that on to the states because it's outside the scope of the convention. If somehow Congress sent it on to the states, then there'd be litigation to say that this is not within the scope of the convention, so it should not be up for ratification. The Supreme Court would absolutely not allow that for ratification. If somehow it made it all the way through that, then it would go on to the states for ratification, where there's no way that something that was not enormously popular around the country would get ratified by the necessary 38 states. It's a very high bar. And all of those protections, that's a protection that I used an example where the right wing would be in fact, most of the country would be very much opposed to the idea of repealing the Second Amendment. Most of the country would also be very much opposed to all of the things that have been brought up
we should mention also
amendments.
that leftists, by and large, are also against eliminating the Second Amendment.
Yeah, that varies more widely, but
I said largely.
But I know quite a few who are, but regardless, if you poll those in the country, they're not popular. There are very, very few things that are popular enough to actually get an amendment in the Constitution. And I would say that one of the very, very few is fighting the corrupting influence of money in politics.
Well, if we've covered the other topic that we started this conversation on about, maybe that it was perhaps alarmist to be worried about this constitutional convention, and I'm still worried a little bit. The other matter on getting the money out of politics, I know that's popular, and that's even bipartisan popular. But does it really matter when we know how corrupting that is, and we know that there are fortunes to be made on that and that depend on that? So how can you really correct that?
Well, fortunately, we've done it before. During the Gilded Age, it was a time very similar to now. The Senate was referred to as the Millionaires Club, and that was millionaires by like 1890s standards, which is pretty comparable to where they are right now. The divide between the rich and the poor at that time was comparable to what it is right now. It passed Great Depression levels several years back, and that's now at Gilded Age levels. And one of the major reforms that was needed to address that issue was the corruption in the Senate. The Senate at that time, the senators were appointed by the state legislatures. The state legislatures were, that process was riddled with bribery, riddled with corruption. The House had been pushing to change for constitutional amendment for direct election for senators for decades up until that point. Finally, in 1893, Nebraska called for an Article 5 convention to propose direct election of senators. That effort was not really organized, so nothing really went anywhere. But in 1901, an organized group of Pennsylvania legislators called for an Article 5 convention, and they not only organized it and passed it in Pennsylvania, but they worked with legislators around the country to pass the Article 5 convention call for direct election of senators in states all over the country. And it wasn't just that effort. The important thing about amending the Constitution is you can't do it by trying just one method. Every method has to work together. And that's why it's so important that people working on this project from different angles work together and support each other and not fight against each other. For direct election of senators, they were pushing through the Article 5 convention process. At the same time, Oregon did what is known as the Oregon Plan, where they had informal votes to recommend senators that the state legislature would then appoint. There's been some good arguments that I've seen that would probably have been ruled unconstitutional if that's the system that we went with and just left that in place. It probably was not constitutional, but it was effective in the short term to try to help change the scope of the makeup of the Senate. And then there were also activists on the ground pushing and lobbying for different things. And all of those worked together to help change the makeup of the Senate enough that once we got to within one or two states away from actually having an Article 5 convention for direct election of the Senate, the senators then ultimately proposed it themselves rather than face the embarrassment of having that get taken away from them. And then in 1913, we got direct election of senators. Right around the same time, we got the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, various state versions of the Corrupt Practices Act. The case of the Montana Corrupt Practices Act is particularly interesting, that the copper barons controlled Montana to such a large extent that in the vote to move the state capital, it was a fight between two different mining companies for where the state capital would be and who would have control of it. And more people voted in that election than there were people living in Montana because they just stuffed the ballot boxes. But when they passed the Montana Corrupt Practices Act, it ended that stranglehold together with the various efforts that were going on around the country. And that lasted for 100 years. Now, we never had a golden age of American politics. Things were still bad. But starting around that time, around 1913, 1914, we entered a point where things were still bad, but they were improving. When there were major scandals like Watergate, laws were changed to make it better. The civil rights era happened during that time. Things were still very, very bad, but they were moving in the right direction. That ended in the 1970s when Powell was appointed to the Supreme Court, and he ushered in what was called the Powell Memo, which was a document that explained that the corporate power should take over the Supreme Court and lobby at the Supreme Court level. And Powell and the other justices then decided the case of Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976 and Bellotti versus First National Bank of Boston in 1978. I mentioned the Bellotti case earlier. And those two cases together threw out the bulk of the campaign finance laws that were in place at the time. They were the basis for the Citizens United decision. The Citizens United decision really just beat a dead horse. By the time that came around, campaign finance was already a joke of what it had been at one time. And we started seeing, if you look at charts on all kinds of issues, wages stopped going up. Real wages, not nominal wages, stopped going up in the 1970s. The wealth gap started skyrocketing starting in the 1970s. All these trends have continued as the Supreme Court has dismantled the campaign finance laws that helped us in the 60, 70 years up until that point move continually in the right direction. So we saw different efforts come together, including an effort for an Article 5 convention to solve this problem last time we faced it. Well, we're facing that problem again, and that's why all of the different efforts need to work together and not oppose each other and work in ways that support each other in order to tackle this enormous problem that we're now facing again.
And one of the problems with that is propaganda machines.
Sure.
When I go visit, there's certain people in my family that it's like everything turns upside down, everything's backward. It's like anything that H.W. Bush did wrong or that George W. Bush did wrong was somehow Obama's fault, even though Obama wasn't even in office yet. But there's no determination of fact. You can't get people that I'm talking about that are in my family and friends. will even concede a point to start from. There's not a thing we can agree on because all the facts are alternative now.
Yeah, that's something that Wolf-PAC has been working on a lot recently. For the last couple of years, we've been going through a restructuring. Because what we found when we first got started in 2011, we were able to go to state legislatures, and we were founded by Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks. He's never run the organization, but he founded it. And he founded it specifically to be separate from him so that its politics could be nonpartisan, even though he is quite partisan himself. And his original vision for it, which was our plan for a long time, was get 20 good volunteers in each state house, and we'll get it through. And that was effective for a while. It was effective until we got organized opposition. And we got 5 states on the board that way. We would go to the state legislatures. We would have meetings with their offices. We would show them the research. The problem was very easy to explain. And we won in 5 states that way. Once we had organized opposition, we started seeing the main groups that have been opposed to us are the Eagle Forum, the John Birch Society. I didn't even realize the John Birch Society still existed until I met them in New Hampshire when they were testifying on the other side of the aisle from me. I thought that they disappeared, but nope, they're still there. And then on the left, we also see groups like Common Cause. And all these groups were opposed to the Balanced Budget Amendment in the 1980s, which was using that tactic. At the time, only right-wing efforts had been trying to use that tactic for a period of about 20 or 30 years. Up until the 1950s, it was for issues all over the place. There were convention calls on everything from one world government to school prayer and all kinds of things, and then actual sensible ones in between. But starting in the 1950s, there were a string of a couple of convention calls in a row that were seen as much more partisan. And that kind of enabled groups like Common Cause in the early 80s to oppose the convention process as an easier method rather than opposing the Balanced Budget Amendment. And that's the same thing that the John Birch Society and the Eagle Forum did as well. They were opposed to the Balanced Budget Amendment, and both of them said the same thing. They would rather see an unbalanced budget at 1789 levels and a balanced budget at levels of today. So they opposed it from the right. And they demonized the process.
People will say, and they often do, I hear this all the time, rather than admit that their party or that their politician or whatever has done something bad, rather than just admit, yeah, that was bad, they'll say both parties are just as bad, because we've got to share the blame somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Even when all of these problems that I experience, or everything that I do as a secular activist, everything I'm doing advocating science, every attack on education that I've ever seen has always only ever come from the right. All of them, without exception. All this dangerous stuff. Never once from a leftist. But they're supposed to be just as bad somehow. And both parties are just as bad. And I will admit on one point they are, on this one thing. I'll say both parties are bad. They're not just as. But on this one matter, on the corruption in politics of being, the oligarchy being owned by corporations and such, I would say that politically the Democrats are just as owned to a large degree as are the Republicans. I can only think of a few examples of Republicans that I don't think of as being owned by corporations, or that don't appear to be. There's
more than you'd expect at the state level. They don't get as much national attention. But that's one of the reasons why Wolf-PAC is going through the state process. Because at the state level, you can still actually talk to politicians. That has gotten harder because of the organized opposition that goes to party leadership. It will always be true, by the way, that at the state level, they're less corrupt, because the ones that are the most corrupt go to Congress. That's kind of like the major leagues of the corruption. So at the state level, they will always be less corrupt. But once we started getting that organized opposition, we took a couple of years to reorganize. And what we've now done is shifted our strategy. our ultimate goal is still the same, the amendment, and to get there using the Article 5 convention process. What we need, though, is power to combat the big money that's opposing us. And you get that power through people. And you get the people through tools called structure-based organizing, is one of the models that we've looked at and adopted. It's been used by labor organizing for decades. We went through training. Jane McAlevey offers training that is geared mostly toward labor organizing, but a lot of groups, including Wolf-PAC, have been looking at adapting it for political purposes. And we decided to do it partially based on a group that was incredibly successful with a similar strategy back in the 1920s. At the time, it was the Prohibition era, and all of the major anti-prohibition groups were putting all their eggs in the basket of trying to elect Al Smith for president. And when Al Smith lost the presidency in 1928, it completely devastated the entire movement. It was the lowest point in the fight to repeal prohibition that they had seen since prohibition had passed in the first place. Pauline Sabin was a Republican National Committee member and the wife of one of the leaders of one of the big groups. And she decided that all those groups, like her husband's and the others, were doing it wrong. So what she did was, with a group of 50 women, launched the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform. And they went around the country and talked to women around the country in different walks of life, people who disagreed with each other on all kinds of things, but just agreed on this one issue, that prohibition is causing crime to skyrocket and ruining the country in all kinds of ways. And they had all the talking points, and when interviewed, they could explain, just like I explained, why the Article 5 convention process meets this and that criteria, and explain about, just like I can explain about money in politics. They could do all of that with prohibition and with the tactics that they were using. But their most effective talking point was their demographics. Their opposition tried to paint them as a bunch of rich aristocrats from New York, which is why they specifically went to poor parts of the country. And within the first year, they grew from 50 people to 350 people, focusing on really organizing people so that they would not just agree with them, but become a part of the movement and go on to organize others. Which is why once they had those 350 organizers, the following year, they had 150,000 organizers. By then, in 1930, they were able to influence some of the elections for Congress in the 1930 election. By 1932, they had 350,000 volunteers. And with those numbers, and that exponential growth was caused by that method of not just trying to get people to agree with you, but by getting people to join your movement, to understand what's going on, and to exist in places where people will then know people who are in this movement. They can then organize in all kinds of areas, all kinds of walks of life. By 1932, they were second only to the Great Depression in causes for the election of Roosevelt, as well as for supermajorities in both people in both parties who were in favor of repealing prohibition. And by 1933, they got the repeal of prohibition passed by Congress. Then went on to the states, and actually went on to the states and was, for the first time ever, used the Article 5 ratification process. There's two processes to ratify an amendment: either the state legislature's vote or state convention's vote. Congress decides which one. And in 1933, for the very first time, we used the Article 5 ratification convention process. And it worked very well, even though people were nervous because they had never used that process before. It was a part of Article 5 we'd never used. But it worked just as designed, and we got the ratification of the 21st Amendment. The final vote for ratification actually came in Utah, where I just was a couple weeks ago. They broadcast it live on national radio, which in 1933 was quite difficult to do. They actually had to pause the convention to bring in the equipment so that they could broadcast themselves as the 38th state to ratify. And that's the model that we're going with now. That's why we need people to join at wolf-pac.com.
Okay, I'll make sure to put a link below. I also want people to understand that one of the issues that I see is, I mentioned dichotomous or binary thinking. Where people only, it's got to be this or that. There's no nuance. There's no. It's not just that it's black or white and there's no gray. There's a spectrum of color in there. There's extenuating circumstances, other things to consider, and things change. So, and that the one element of the ability to change, or the evolution of the population, as we put it, is that I've been listening to some right-wing people who are worried that white people won't be the dominant demographic, and they think there's some like plot or some conspiracy to eliminate white people's dominance or privilege or whatever. And the way I look at it is that that sort of thing has always changed. I mean, look at the demographics of this country 500 years ago, for example, was very different. And also, one of the things that change is here in Texas, I've heard people say that they are born into the Republican Party. My parents are Republicans, so I'm Republican. They don't even know. They think you're supposed to vote Republican forever because your parents did, or because you were born. You're not born into a political party. If this were the 1930s or the 1950s, like you're talking about, at that time, if I was alive then, I would have been a Republican then, because the Republican Party and the Democratic Party had changed their positions on so many issues after that. And I just want people to understand that, these things change all the time, and it should be more about the policies than the labels. That's another huge problem, because anything that has the word ism behind it will be defined differently by the people who identify with that label than the people who are trying to bastardize that label. So, whether it's leftism or feminism or Marxism or communism, they're going to have very different definitions. And I'm not saying, because I mentioned some of these, that I necessarily advocate or side with any of that. I'm not a communist. I'm not a Marxist. I'm not a socialist. But because I am a leftist, well, then they're going to put me in all of those categories, because you have to lump everything together like that. Again, it's a limitation on the thinking. Think about the policy. Think about the legislation that is being promoted. What are the positives and negatives of that, regardless of who posted it, of who's promoting it? Figure out why would you individually promote that, and what is that going to do to or for other people? The reason that I identify as leftist myself, aside from taking a battery of tests that all show me, in the independent tests, separately published, that all put me in exactly the same position in the libertarian left quadrant of the political compass, is the other reason that I identify as leftist is because I value human rights over corporate profits. And I think that's the easiest summary. So when you make laws that benefit corporations at the expense of people, then that's where I'm going to be fighting against that legislation, regardless of whether it was a Democrat or Republican that published it.
Most Republican voters, as opposed to the Republican politicians, other than the word leftist, agree with that position. And when you talk to them, you can see that. And we're training people on structure-based organizing. It's a series of 3 trainings. We do it once a month. It's open to people who are not part of Wolf-PAC as well. We're starting our next series of them this weekend. So if you go to wolf-pac.com/discord, you can join our server and join for that training. And it teaches you how to have these kinds of conversations with people who may disagree with you. There's something called the 6-step structured organizing conversation, which goes through how to have an introduction, how to agitate on an issue, see where people are coming from, have these kinds of genuine conversations to help get people to see the issue from a point of view that shows them why they should not only agree with you, but fight by your side for it and help organize others. And that's the main thing that we're working on right now. That's our primary purpose at the moment, to try to build those numbers across political lines.
Well, then in closing, let me just add one more thing, because, I realize that you and I are politically seemingly together on a couple of things, but this conversation exists because you sent me an email telling me that one of my previous videos had something terribly wrong in it, and you were here to correct me. And so everybody listening to Mr. Fieldman now is because he's correcting me, and I'm not. I don't believe in the what is it, the echo chamber. It matters
Personally,
to
I
me.
love being wrong. When you're wrong, that's when you learn new things. I was
I've
wrong
said that
about
at the
things
same
about
time
Article
because
5 so
when
many
when do
times
you
before I
learn?
learned more.
When do you learn more than when you found out you were mistaken?
Yeah. And we've seen that from and quite a few we had in Oregon, for example. This was not somebody we even spoke to, but their legislative council had testified previously against the convention process, and then later came back to the state legislature and said, I was wrong. I did more research. Turned out I was completely wrong.
Very good.
And yeah, I have that. I know that you're a skeptic, and I didn't reach out to you because you're a leftist. I reached out to you because you're a skeptic. And I knew that skeptics, what that term means is that you're going to listen to people with different viewpoints and not just dig into what you've heard before.
Thank you very much, sir. We've been slightly over an hour at this. I'm going to have to cut it off because I have to go pack and prepare and all of that to fly out of here around dawn tomorrow. So thank you very much for being on.
Thank you.
And if you have any other statements to throw out there, if we've got your link, we'll put it below. Make sure you get it to me in the email so I can do that.
Yep, wolf-pac.com. And the best way to go is wolf-pac.com/discord. You can join the conversations with others there. You can join our structure-based organizing training. Even if you don't join Wolf-PAC, that training is useful for organizing in all kinds of issues.